Greetings and welcome to one portion of our social emotional learning sessions. In this section of our series on social emotional learning, we'll cover the social skills part of it. During this lesson, we'll address how to assess social skills, select the behaviors that the students need to master, plan the lessons, and of course, teach them. The PBIS model, Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. And as we see depicted here in the triple-tiered model, 80% of our kids will arrive at the schoolhouse door with social skills that are appropriate for the school setting. However, 15% of them will need to work in small groups with kids who have similar needs, similar social skills that need enhancement. And then there's the 5% of kids who are intervention resistant, who have very strong and ingrained behavioral patterns that are oppositional to what we promote in the schools. For those youngsters, we'll be working with them individually. This session will address assessment, planning, and teaching primarily for tiers 2 and 3 of the PBIS model. Our kids who need interventions because their social skills are not yet pro-social and appropriate. How exactly do we set up our social skills groups? Here are some basic guidelines, and we'll go much more in depth as we move through this session. First of all, we want to get some kids together who have the same social skills deficits, ones we're going to build so that they become more socially skilled. Now, why 2 to 5? Well, with this number, everyone gets a chance to observe others, to see the behavior being demonstrated and by peers, and all of them get a chance to model and practice the skills. We'll set up rules and procedures. Now, periodically throughout this session, you'll see these red question marks, and you can stop the session at this particular point to consider these questions, devise your own answers, and then re-enter the program so that we can compare your answers and the ones that we find in the literature. So you might want to pause it at this point and consider what rules and what procedures would you want to implement so that your group is structured, pro-social. Pause now. All right, I suspect you came up with some such as only one person talks at a time. Be respectful to others, although we may need to operationalize exactly what is meant by being respectful. Does it mean restating what the person has already said? Does it mean that when you're commenting on somebody's demonstration of a behavior, we start out with what was done correctly first, and then we talk about how that demonstration could have been improved upon? Is it the use of I messages when providing criticism so that those comments are less confrontational, less likely to result in refusals and resistance and defiance? We want to teach the easy to master skills first, but why? Feel free to pause the session at this point and consider that question. Well, as with anything that kids are learning, we have to start out with the basics. You need the foundational skills before you can move to the more elaborate skills and building upon them and modifying them for various situations. Some other ones here. We want to teach to high status kids first. Why? Again, feel free to pause the session. We want to get the leaders on our side. We want to convince them that it is a good idea to learn these skills. We want to have them demonstrate the skills first. We want to provide reinforcement to them because the followers will then go along with the leader. We want to get that high status kid on our side and buying into the learning of new social skills. We also want to collect data on performance. There's an emphasis now in our field on data-based interventions, that we collect numerical information regarding a youngster's performance, how many times the behavior happens during a certain period, the length of it, the magnitude, the form of it, and we collect this data so we can determine, well, what is the starting point with the social skill for that particular youngster? We can also monitor progress. We can also involve the youngster in self-monitoring of his or her behaviors. We will get into this much more in depth in our session, but using self-monitoring so that we build internal management of the behavior versus outer management of the actions. Like anything we're teaching, we want to build in some novelties, some fun, and challenges that can be achieved into our lessons. That builds the motivation for the youngsters. We also want to make these lessons pertinent to their lives. Why do we have to learn this stuff? We're hoping that it becomes evident because we use examples from their lives. We have them demonstrate them in realistic situations in which they're embedded at the moment. And how would you modify any of these following recommended skills to be more applicable to the life of certain youngsters? We're going to get to that not in the next slide, as it says, but rather deeper into the session. The process in which we'll be engaging typically involves 8 steps. The first is to determine, well, which youngsters are going to comprise this group that deals with a particular social skill today or this week. We do so by completing checklists, and we'll be looking at many of them in just a little bit. We then want to determine, well, how are we going to engage these youngsters? How are we going to motivate them to want to take part in our lessons? Hopefully it's because they see that there's a benefit to showing these behaviors in the school setting. It behooves them to do so. And we also engage, of course, in our positive behavior management strategies that focus on luring the youngster into showing the appropriate behavior and then catching that kid being good. We do need to identify specifically what behaviors it is we're trying to teach. You'll remember that from your SPED 702 classroom management course, and if you haven't yet taken that course, you're not one of my students, or you've forgotten the material, do contact me and I can send you the link to where it's located on YouTube, and you can learn about how we define behaviors, identify the dimension of behavior, the aspect of it that we want to change, and which data recording procedure we would use for that particular behavior action. Then we plan those lessons in units. Some of you are fortunate to have a curriculum, a social skills curriculum available for you at your facility. Others of you do not have that, and you have to develop it on your own. But nowadays, of course, there's just so much out there online, and you can type in social skills lessons for taking turns, for greeting visitors, and you'll find those lessons out there on the internet. You gather your students together and we talk about, well, why are we together? What's the reason for this group joining together? Remember that those reasons should appeal to the youngsters, not just, well, we got to learn this because the curriculum says so. we discuss the importance of good social skills, how it's going to help them make friends, it's going to help them be successful in school, it's going to help them out in the real world, it's going to help them to obtain jobs, it is going to help them in family life in the future. And then we teach those skills. Of course, we'll be moving through those steps in just a bit. However, before we do so, it's important that you have a document in front of you. And that document can be obtained by going to our Blackboard site for those of you who are in my class. For those of you who are not, you can write to me at Dr. Mack at Behavior. That's behavior spelled in the American way. We leave out the U over here. Dr. Mack at BehaviorAdvisor.com, and I will send you a link to the document that has the materials that we're going to be using as we move through our session today. That document that we mentioned will be especially helpful to those of you who are in my class. You'll know that you have a major assignment which involves planning out a thematic unit of instruction, 5 lessons that have been developed to teach a social skill in a particular youngster that is not yet up to snuff. And that handout will assist you in your assignment. For those of you who are not in my class, you can find examples of social skills units at that address on my website at behavioradvisor.com/socialskills.html. But essentially, the steps that we follow when teaching skills are: let's spend some time on step 1 of the 8 steps in our process, which is figuring out which kids will be part of our small group, or if we're working individually with a youngster, which social skills does that youngster need most to develop. Although we can also use these checklists, there are many out there for the entire classroom so that we can determine which ones we work on at certain times during the day or during the first 10 minutes of each lesson, where we talk about the behaviors that all of us should be demonstrating here in our classroom. Now, if we were in a live session, we'd be engaged in an activity right now in which you'll select one of the checklists in that document that you have in your hands. If you don't, write to me at Dr. Mack at BehaviorAdvisor.com and ask for the link to that document. But you can go out there on the internet and you can type in social skills checklist for youngsters with autism, and something that will come up that's particular to kids on the spectrum. You can type in social skills checklist for preschool children. Oh, let me correct myself. Pre-kindergarten children, because of course pre-K is a school, is education. And you'll select a checklist, and then you'd locate some of the actions that pertain to one of your youngsters, or perhaps a number of youngsters. You could make some columns and make different marks for different kids. You could write down the initials of various youngsters next to the social skill that's in the checklist, the one that the youngsters need to develop. And then we want to think about, gee, that deficit that I've just identified in a youngster's social skills set, is that a skill deficit or a performance deficit, or NKY, not yet known? Now, for some of you, you say, what's the difference between a skills deficit and a performance deficit? Very much like I asked that question before I became familiar with it. A skill deficit is when the youngster just doesn't have that ability, has not ever been taught it. It has not been promoted in that youngster's life. And so we need to teach it from scratch, from the beginning. Where other youngsters have demonstrated that they can be proficient in showing it. but they're only showing it during the social skills lessons, or only in our classroom, but not outside the classroom door. That the youngster has a skill, is able to demonstrate the skill, but isn't performing it, perhaps just in certain situations. Were we in a live session together, and I hope to have that opportunity someday, we would engage in a follow-up activity, a second activity, in which we would look further into our document to page 10, at least that's how the document is composed at present, but rather than look for the page, let's look for the social competence screening form, which will help to ID the kids who are most in need of social skills instruction. Now we would follow up where we'd ask you to find the second form, the social skills matching form, which will assist you in determining which youngsters best fit into your group. There's a lot to consider too. I mean, does gender make a difference in how we comprise the groups? Do we want a bully and the bullied persons in the same group? Members from different gangs being in the same group? Is that a good idea? Is that not a good idea? Now, for those of you who are teachers, you complete these forms. It takes about 10 minutes, and I would be available to answer any questions you might have. But what about you folks who aren't yet teachers? Or you're teaching 1-to-1 or 1-to-3, and so how does this forms, or how are these forms going to fit into your setting? Okay, in those cases, I'd like you to think back, to hearken back, to recollect a classroom in which you once sat as a lower grade student or an upper grade student. Think of all those peers who were sitting around you and rank them. Complete these two forms, thinking about that classroom in which you once sat. Certainly we educators and school-based personnel are astute observers of behavior, and childhood behavior in particular, but it's also important to get the student's self-perception of his or her abilities in the social realm. And we do so by asking them to complete a form that you'll find in your packet that you have in your hands titled the Teaching Social Skills Self-Report. There's also another one that you'll find in your document called the Ready Report. And what we have our youngsters do is to complete these, perhaps with our assistance if they need some help with the reading or the understanding of the terminology, or to better delineate exactly what it is we're looking for. You're looking at these documents now and thinking, gee, what would I use this information for? For what purposes? And so why don't you pause the pod, easy for me to say, pause the podcast at this point and think about, gee, how would this information help me in better understanding the student and in teaching social skills? There are a number of benefits that derive from doing this so. First of all, we gain a deeper understanding of the student's life space, life history, perceptions of whether they believe that social skills are important. Are they deluding themselves by believing that they have a higher skill level than is actually the case? Certainly it is human nature to cooperate with folks we like, respect, and admire. And part of that is having positive social interactions with each other. We can use these forms as conversation starters, a way to get to know each other, a way to discuss the importance of picking up certain social skills, and we can then motivate the youngster to become more actively involved. Yes, we determine the accuracy of their self-perceptions, and we gain an insight from the Ready report as to the level of their willingness to change their present behaviors. Are they oppositional to adopting these new interaction strategies that we hope to promote? Or are they saying, you know what I've got just ain't working for me, and you've got my attention, teacher, I am ready to learn? The Ready report is part of a larger diagnostic prescriptive assessment instrument called the Behavior Transformation Guide. You'll find it on behavioradvisor.com. It's especially helpful with kids who are intervention resistant, who see no need to change their behavioral patterns and their social skills repertoire. If you and I had the pleasure of being in each other's company at this particular point, the activity in which we would be engaging is I would be asking you to locate your completed social skills matching form. And by yourself, or with a colleague or two, decide of all the social skills that were listed and you gave them some consideration, which one's the most important one to teach first? And then you would define that behavior in precise terminology that is specific to the setting in which you want the youngster to display the behavior and the particular students of concern who have difficulties with this particular behavior. We need to be able, with the definition that you're devising, that we can determine whether that action has been displayed or whether it hasn't been. And we need for different people who are using that definition to agree that a behavior did exist, was displayed, or was not displayed in the proper form or at all. Now, when we're devising a definition, we've got to remember the two terms that are important as our criteria. It must be observable. We don't do any mind reading. We don't say, does it on purpose or does it for attention. Okay? It needs to be an observable action, and it has to be measurable. We have to be able to say, yes, it happened, or no, it didn't. And we can count the number of times it happened, or we can put a stopwatch on it and figure out the length of time that it happens. Okay? If you need more assistance in defining a behavior, of course, I would be glad to send you the link to the video that's up there on YouTube. Just write to me at drmack@behavioradvisor.com. Now that you've devised a precisely worded, observable, and measurable definition of the behavior, you have done so, haven't you? Yes, indeed you have. You have defined it in observable and measurable terms. You've identified the dimension of behavior, the aspect of the behavior that needs to change, the one you're going to focus on. Are you going to be focusing on the frequency, convincing the youngster through our instruction to show the behavior more often? Are you going to work on duration, the length of time that the behavior is being displayed? Maybe you're focusing on latency, the time span that transpires between a stimulus, the do it, and the response, the kid doing it. It could be the topography, the form that the behavior takes. Maybe you're focusing on the magnitude, the power, the oomph, the energy behind the behavior. But now that you've done so, you'll know exactly which behaviors you want your kids to display. You'll know when they've been successful in their attempts to show that behavior. You could even have the kids self-monitor and self-evaluate about their performance. How did they do? You can find out more on self-monitoring of behavior on behavioradvisor.com inside the Intervention Strategies tab. And so we collect accurate data on progress that the youngsters are making. For what reasons again? Why are we collecting numerical information regarding the behavior? That's right, thank you. All those reports that we have to fill out that now want documentation, but they want documentation in numbers, percents, ratios. And so we have to define our behavior precisely, observably, and measurably so that we can collect that numerical data for the decision making regarding the youngster's IEP or the behavior intervention plan. We make decisions about, gee, can we now move on to something else? Or do we need to continue to work on what is listed here in the youngster's individualized educational plan or behavior intervention plan? Oh, and of course, to motivate the youngster. We can chart out this numerical data, and hopefully the youngster sees an upward profile line that evidences progress. And the kid can say, I am proud of what I've accomplished. Well, gosh, all of this time together, we're nearing a half-hour point, and we've just been talking about the introduction in step 1 of 8. Do realize that some of the steps we're going to breeze through quite quickly in the next segment of this particular social skills series of videos. But yes, next time you tune in with me in part 2, we'll be engaging in step 2, planning the lessons based upon our assessments. See you soon in that next installment in our series on social skills.